All right, so here's what we're going to do today. I might have mentioned there would be a quiz today. Maybe I didn't, but it'll be a fun quiz. Don't worry. It'll be a fun quiz, group quiz on torture and loss of memory. So, glad you're looking forward to that. Has to do with the reading for today. So if you look at your syllabi, which you have with you at all times. Today is the 12th. We've got Meredith Michael's Persons, Brains, and Bodies. You had suggested readings from Locke and Hume with the uninteresting title in both of the papers of personal identity. They both used that, which is interesting. Locke was first, Hume followed on that. What I want to do today is wrap up our discussion of the background to this question of identity and look at in detail a couple of the points that are raised in the reading, the dialogue from last time, John Perry's dialogue on immortality and personal identity. And by way, I'm going to start our discussion sort of where we left off, say a little bit more about the no-self theory, the illusion theory. We'll start with that today. I only touched on that very, very briefly. Then see whether or not that's satisfying. Then move to the psychological continuity view, which is an idea that it's our mental states, psychology, memories, and so forth. We'll see that that's a view of John Locke, and see how the limitations of that. And then look at a soul theory in response to those problems with the illusion theory, the psychological continuity theory, and the bodily theory, which we've already looked at last time. We'll return to it again at the end today. I want to have about half the class, maybe a little less than half the class, about 30 minutes, devoted to the quiz that you'll have, related specifically to Meredith Michael's reading, that pushes a particular narrative against the, let's call it common sense view, that the self is consciousness, memories, mental states, the sort of view that John Locke advocates for. So that's our plan for today. Let me just start with a rather unexpected view. Has anyone taken contemporary world religion? Excuse me. They call it comparative world religions here. Anyone take world religions? Do you remember the Buddhists' understanding of what self is? What do the Buddhists say about the self?
There is no self.
That there is no self. So there's not much to say about it. What is the self? Nothing. It's nothing. And that solves a lot of problems. What is... Because the questions we're asking in this class, with respect to the metaphysical question of identity, there's basically three interweaving questions. What is the self? What am I? How unified is that self? Is it a bunch of different things, different compartments, so to speak, or is it one unified thing? And then the third question, which is primarily the interest in the dialogue from John Perry, what is it that persists through time? If there is an identical self through time, does it persist through time? And the Buddhist response is no, basically to all those questions, except for the first. That's a weird answer. What am I? No, that's not the right answer to the question, what am I? The answer to that is nothing. How in the world do they get to that? Because our intuitions tell us, I have thoughts, and I'm doing things based on those thoughts. I have a history, I have memories of doing things in the past. I have expectations of doing things in the future. I already talked a little bit about this. I have plans for the future. What is the first... This is not... You're not going to be tested on this, but it's relevant to the question of identity in Buddhism. What is the first noble truth within Buddhism? What did the Buddha, after achieving enlightenment or nirvana, what is the first noble truth? Got to know that if you took a class in Buddhism. What is it? I heard something.
Is that there is suffering?
There is suffering. Not only there is suffering, all of life is shit. That's basically what he said. But I don't know the translation in Sanskrit. Basically, life is suffering. That's what he said. And then he got people to follow it, which is kind of surprising. Life is terrible. Yeah, it is. It is all... You come out of the womb, what's the first thing you do?
Scream.
You start screaming, you're crying. Then you go through adolescence and that uncomfortable stage. It's just totally awful. Then you're done with adolescence. You're basically an adult, and then you have to get a job. That sucks. You have to support yourself. It's awful. It's suffering. You recognize your peers have things that you don't have. That pisses you off. You need to get those things. That causes more suffering. Then you get older. You start to understand things. You start to see. And then your brain deteriorates, and your body has deteriorated. That starts deteriorating by the age of 35, by the way. 35. Things start going downhill. Mentally, you're like, I can reach that. I can run after that. And then you try it, and you realize, what the hell? What's going on? Do I have a different body? You do. You have a different body than you used to have. So you start to mentally understand things, and then you die. Life is suffering. So that's, it's not a very good lecture to start with on Monday, as you say. And then you look outside. We live in Santa Barbara. What the hell's up with the cold? And you can't see anything. This place sucks. Do you see how that can cause suffering? Why does this place suck? Why am I unhappy? Because I desire things. And who do I desire things for? Me. The Buddhist is saying, your suffering is a result of desire. Your desire is a result of a misconception of self, a presumption, an illusion that you are an identical, enduring, and different thing from other selves. For the Buddhist, the enlightenment is actually nirvana, which literally means nothingness, nothingness. It's the recognition or the dissolution of yourself, which is to say all the barriers between you and everything else melt away, and you recognize the interdependence of everything. So in that interesting metaphysical and ethical worldview, there is no self. It's an illusion. You fail to recognize the interdependence of everyone and everything. And when you recognize that, your sense of desires for things that only I have, which cause greater suffering, melt away. David Hume doesn't say any of that, but he has a similar conclusion as the Buddhists do. The Buddhists argue for a no-self, and Hume is sometimes known as a bundle theorist, and it amounts to the same thing. What is the self? It is nothing but a bundle of perceptions. And Rauhut, you didn't have a required reading on Hume, but there's material that you were required in Rauhut about David Hume, and also about John Locke. The Buddhists argue that there is no self. There are conscious states, there are physical states, but there's nothing that underlies the physical states and the conscious states that stays the same. Hume says the same thing. Whenever I look most intimately into myself, I can never catch a glimpse of myself. I only catch these fleeting perceptions that go by with exceeding rapidity, as he puts it. Hume is a great writer. Exceeding rapidity. If there is a self, it's nothing but a bundle of perceptions. You close your eyes, you imagine, what am I? You have brief recollections, fleeting recollections of you looking into the mirror, or a sidewise glance from as you imagine someone else looking at you, or looking at pictures, or thinking about certain memories that you have, or feelings, or emotions, and so on. You are not any one of those feelings, or thoughts, or perceptions, nor are you something that has those, underneath those. They're just our perceptions. They're just our physical states. There's nothing that has them. There is no self underlying all of this changing meat bag, to use. Meat puppet. Let's not be disgusting. Let's go with meat puppet. Just kidding. That's just as bad. And the music is horrible. No offense if you like the band, the Meat Puppets.
What? There?
It is? You never heard of the Meat Puppets? They're terrible, but as the name, I think the name is enough to tell you. Remember we talked about language and how names do a lot. In any case, Hume is saying the same thing as the Buddhists, and I don't know that Hume read about Buddhism. I don't have any evidence of that. Oftentimes you have independently similar views come about, but the Buddhists had it well before. Hume is making the case that the word I is a mere grammatical necessity. It's a placeholder, a subject holder. I think. I'm going to run to the store. Well, what is that that's running to the store? The I doesn't refer to anything but a bundle of perceptions, a physical body that changes over time. There is no enduring self underlying it. Although we have that presumption. When you look out into the world, you kind of imagine yourself. That word homunculus comes back, that little person that's in your head looking out, that's perceiving things, that your eyes are taking in information so that yourself can understand it. Think of it in those terms. You're in a theater and you're editing the screen, the movie. That's what we kind of see ourselves as. We're taking information in from our hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and we're compiling all of that into a unified stream. That is our self. And either we are the stream, which is a problem for Hume, because if we're the stream, that stream is constantly changing, becoming something else, or, which I think most of us are intuitively assume, we are behind that, editing the stream, having the perceptions, and so on. But if we're the ones having the perceptions, think of that image we had of man as industrial palace, as a machine. And there were little people inside the machine, do you remember? Activating certain modules. Here's the part of the brain doing this. Here's the stomach. And there's little people in there working it. Notice the question we asked there was, if the machine has little people working inside it, do those little people also have little people inside of them? Little homunculi? Actually, that's redundant, little homunculi. That's like saying a little person. And I don't mean really small, just redundant. Do they have people inside of them? And on, ad infinitum, or in an infinite regress. A similar problem arises, Hume and the Buddhists would argue, if you assume there is some self that has the perceptions, that is interpreting the perceptions. Well, is there something inside that self that's interpreting the perceptions that can make sense of those perceptions? And we have the same infinite regress. We avoid that problem by just saying, you know what, there is no self. Nothing endures. Nothing is numerically identical through time.
Where do the Buddhists think that desire comes from then?
It comes from the illusion of an enduring self.
Okay.
Now, I can't get into this now. That's a great question because there's more to it than just that. Because within Buddhist philosophy, the history of philosophy, a question arises. Are we to get rid of all desires? Are all desires bad? What if I have a desire for nirvana? That sounds like a good desire. And I think there's ways of parsing that such that we can say, it's these kinds of desires that cause suffering. My desire for fame, for money, for riches, and so forth, that causes, in fact, more suffering than it does benefit. Whereas the desire for nirvana is a desire for enlightenment, for a recognition of what is the true reality, according to Buddhism. So, it's an easy move to say, look around the world. What is it that endures, that stays the same? And remember, we're looking at numerical identity. I'm not interested in qualitative identity. What's the difference between those two with respect to personal identity?
Qualitative is numerical, and identity is.
Oh, sorry. So there's qualitative identity and numerical identity. What's the difference between those two?
Numerical refers to numbers. I had them switched.
It does have to do with number. In particular,
Qualitative is like identical twins where they look the same, but it's a different person. But
There are two
numerical
of them.
is the same exact thing. Like
There's
the
one.
Same, there's one.
exactly. If you accuse me of stealing your bicycle because you didn't use the U-lock, you're supposed to use a U-lock. Apparently, you don't use the U-lock. So just steal it. I don't know. And I've got your bike, but it's not yours. It's simply one that's qualitatively similar. That would be my defense, Your Honor. It's not his bike. It's simply the same make and model, right? Like, let's imagine you drive the same car as I do, right? Let's imagine you drive a Porsche 911. Right. And I say, hey, you got the same car. We don't mean numerically identical car, because if you had my car, then I wouldn't have my car. You would have it, and it wouldn't be this. That's not what we mean, right? Just kidding. I don't have a Porsche. I have a Mercedes-Benz or a BMW. Either one of those, because that's all that people drive in Santa Barbara. BMW. Am I wrong about that? Did you notice how many BMWs there are here, or are you just used to
After you
seeing
said it.
all of them? They're everywhere. Why is that? Did I tell you this already? It seems like I've mentioned this before.
Yeah.
I did mention this before. It's totally irrelevant again, but it's still striking to me. I sold my other one. I told you I bought two just to fit in. I sold one of them because that's excessive. Buddhist desire thing and all that. was I saying then? So numerical identity. If I'm going to be me and have desires about tomorrow and plan for tomorrow, I'm planning for me, not someone similar to me. That's why the illusion theory seems so counterintuitive. I wake up tomorrow, I assume it's the same person who went to sleep at night. What is the connection between me today and me tomorrow? If there's none, then we can't make sense of prisons, we can't make sense of rewards and so forth, because it's a different person altogether. So our question then, a question raised by Gretchen on her deathbed. She's got 3 days left to live, remember? She's going to die. She wants hope that some part of her will continue on. And I asked you this last time. If you believe in immortality, what aspect of you would you presume continues on? Locke is going to argue, and I'm going to erase this because there's not enough space. This board is absurd. Oh, you know what? Oh, I can actually use this. Maybe. Up screen. You see that yet? I'm all right. Okay. So Locke is going to argue for memory in particular. He'll also refer to it as consciousness. Memory is simply the extent to which consciousness extends backward in time. He's interested in what we might call a forensic understanding of self. What is it that would continue on and deserve punishment and reward in the afterlife? He doesn't know. Maybe it's the soul that houses consciousness and memories. That's another way of putting that. It's so squeaky here. Is the psychological continuity view. As opposed to the animalism, or more generally, the bodily continuity view. The psychological continuity view says, according to Locke, that identity goes wherever consciousness goes. And this is common sense to us when we look at his Prince and Cobbler thought experiment. Does anyone know what that is? What's his Prince and Cobbler thought experiment? Here's the Prince, got a little hat. You know what a cobbler is?
Like food?
What's that?
Like food?
Like a shoe preparer.
Shoemaker. Has anyone seen The Cobbler? Yeah. Adam Sandler movie. Surprisingly not horrible. Which is weird for him because he has another movie related to this question. 50 First Dates. And maybe another one, too, having to do with memory and identity. Isn't there another one Sandler was in? The Cobbler's where he takes on, when he puts the shoes on, he takes on the identity of the person.
I can't think of the name. I know what you're talking
So there's another one?
Yeah.
It's amazing. There's so many philosophical themes to be in movies that Adam Sandler was. You all know who Adam Sandler is, right? Objectively terrible as an actor. And yet, that movie was pretty good. Okay, so, and I don't mean what I'm saying. If you guys like to meet puppets, if you like Adam Sandler, it's hard for me to say that, but that's fine. Those are really just subjective. Horribly. So, here's the thought experiment. What is the thought experiment? The Prince and the Cobbler. Anyone know that? Anyone seen Freaky Friday? Also Adam Sandler? Maybe. Doesn't matter. What happens in Freaky Friday? Yeah.
The mother and daughter gets switched in their bodies. Like the mother becomes the daughter becomes the mother, yet they still look the same.
That's confusing. They become each other? How do you mean? What happens? What's so freaky about this particular Friday?
They're still the same person, they're just in different bodies.
That's actually, well, I don't know. It depends on how we want to explain it. Are they the same person in different bodies? Do we then say, imagine the daughter wakes up, oh my God, I'm in my mom's body. We go along with that and say, yeah, that's what happened. Because identity, self, goes with consciousness. That's basically, this is John Locke's Prince and the Cobbler thought experiment, which he got from watching the movie Freaky Friday in the 1700s. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's all I was gonna say.
And since our intuitions seem to be perfectly fine with that, can you all see that in the back? Okay, and is it useful for me to use this thing? It's not very clean. It seems then Locke's thought experiment follows, and he's open to the idea that wherever, and notice the consciousness which gets transferred from the prince into the cobbler's body, this is the mental states, the memories, and so forth. He doesn't tell us where it's housed because he doesn't know. He's open to the possibility that consciousness is in the brain. Consciousness is in the pinky finger, he mentions at one point. And if you lose your pinky finger, you've lost, your identity goes with that. So wherever your little nub is, that's you. But he doesn't really think that. It could be the soul. He's open to that. And if the soul is immortal, but it doesn't house consciousness and memories and so forth, then that's not you. Who cares if it's an immortal soul? If it's not me that, and this is Gretchen's question, if it's not me that's living in the afterlife, then who cares? Why would I punish a soul that doesn't have the memories and consciousness of my life? Why would I reward a soul that doesn't have the memories and consciousness of my life? Locke finds that to be absurd. It only makes sense that the soul is you if it's housing or is conscious and has those memories. But notice, once you've said that, invoking the soul, as we're going to see from, to jump now back into the reading from John Perry, Chaplain Miller invokes the soul theory to avoid the very problems that we've seen with the bodily continuity view and the psychological continuity view. In both of those cases, it's unclear what counts as numerical identity. What connects myself now with myself in the past. I should note, Locke will talk about memory, and he'll talk about it in terms of necessary connect. And it's clear why you would think of memory as being necessary for identity. If I have no memories, it's unclear that I'm the same person through time. And if you look at this in terms of a very general schema, so to speak, here I am as a young person, here I am in my middle age, and here I am as an old person. According to Locke, what connects these, what identifies these different states of affairs, these different selves, so to speak, through time, is that there is a direct memory link. When I'm in my middle age, I can have and do have memory connections to me when I was young, and therefore we can say B is equal to A because of that memory link. Memory is necessary. In some cases, he says sufficient. It's enough for establishing identity. No problem. When I'm old, I also have direct memory links to when I was a middle-aged person. There again, we find B and C are equal because of that memory link. But Locke admits at one point that it's possible I do not have a direct memory link between myself when I'm old and myself when I'm young. And on Locke's own interpretation, what does that mean? It means me as a youth does not equal me as an old person. And therefore we get A does not equal C. Logically, what problem have I just illustrated?
If C is B and B is A, then C should also equal A.
Right. And what principle is that called?
Fallacy?
No. What principle does this demonstrate? If A equals C, if A equals B, and if B equals C, necessarily A equals C. What's that called? No, not the error. What's the logical principle called? Sorry.
Deductive reasoning?
It is deductive reasoning. What specific deductive reasoning is it? The principle of transitivity. So I'm deducing that if A equals B, and if B equals C, it necessarily follows, on pains of contradiction and irrationality, that A equals C. But notice what I just put. A does not equal C. Why? Because of the lack of memory connection. So, go ahead.
Oh, but didn't he counter that by saying you could have indirect connections?
Yes, he didn't, but Lockeans after him would. Very good. So 1 second. So if my theory, whatever it is, in this case it's about identity, butts up against and conflicts with a basic law of logic or basic law of mathematics or basic law of science or something like that, that's a hint that something's wrong with my theory not something wrong with the basic principle of logic. If I claim to levitate, as transcendental meditators claim to do and have since the 1960s, transcendental meditation, we can teach you how to levitate. Levitate, what does that mean? What does it imply? That means you float. You can learn how to float and violate what? Laws of gravity. Which is more likely? That you're actually violating laws of gravity, or transcendental meditation is a bit of nonsense. Which one's more likely?
Definitely flipping.
I did. Well, your silence tells me it's too obvious to even say. So I'll go with your answer that, of course, transcendental meditation has a huge burden to prove that they can do this, and they haven't done so thus far. So we might say this fails, or, as you noted, we can have indirect memory links. I, as an old person, have a direct memory link to myself like a minute ago. And that self had a direct memory link to the same self a minute before that. You can get it very, very specific and connect that all the way back. And that memory link is the chain that establishes identity through time. But that doesn't address all the problems, in particular ones that Hume raises, and in particular ones that scientists would raise today about what in the world memories are. Memories are not video recollections. We don't remember what happened by simply replaying it as if a video in our heads. Memory is constructed. And Hume actually said something similar to this, well before our understanding, the neuroscientific understanding of how memory works. If Hume were alive today, he would have loved this analogy of motion pictures. You know why they used to call movies motion pictures? Do you know why they called them that? Because they were pictures that moved. And if they moved at the right speed, it gave you the illusion of a unified stream, a unified whole. In fact, Hume uses this language. We think we presume erroneously that there's an underlying self that's perceiving things fluidly. But in fact, the reality is there's just a bunch of perceptions coming in all at once that our brains have gotten used to corralling into a unified whole. If you really saw each perception, it's an individual, separate thing, like in the moving pictures. It's literally a picture that's framed together, and if it goes at the right speed, it gives the illusion of a unified whole and of motion and so on. If you see it slow down just enough, you can recognize, oh, I see, the reality. They're just independent individual pictures. And so what memory is, it isn't a matter of replaying stories in our head, although it seems that way. We know that memory is a lot more difficult and complex. The more time and events that have happened in between now and the thing that you're remembering, the more lenses through which you see that original event. You reconstruct what happens. Some reconstructions are better than others, but we know we never get a perfect recollection. This is why testimony, eyewitness testimony in courts, is never sufficient by itself. Never sufficient by itself, because we have a better understanding, or let me put it another way. We've recognized that memory is a lot more complex and a lot more flawed than we perhaps initially thought. Now, why, let's see, I'll do that. The memory theory seems to make a lot of sense. I guess I should do this. Down the screen. The memory theory makes a lot of sense. Psychological memory theory does. But it's subject to all the same problems as we've been just discussing with respect to numerical identity and the lack of continuity through time. And therefore, this was all built up to this last couple of pages in the reading. In particular, page 190 of Perry's article. So if you don't have that reading with you, just note it's page 190 and 191. And in it, Miller and Gretchen have both been discussing, Gretchen's wire off here, discussing this question of what it is the self that would continue on. And how it is that we identify each other and so on. Miller eventually gets to, after having gone through the problems of the bodily continuity view, right, how things constantly are changing, psychological continuity view, which is a helpful link but not enough by itself to constitute identity through time, and finally to the soul theory. Miller is going to be adopting what we'll see is basically similar to Descartes' arguments. It's just that John Perry puts into Miller's mouth some pretty bad arguments, as we're going to see. And as Gretchen's asking Miller these questions, because she's looking for some kind of hope, some kind of justification to believe in the afterlife, she offers him some chocolates. This is a little bit before this part of the reading. I don't remember exactly now where's the chocolates. Somebody explain to me the chocolates example. Can you tell me what it's the point of it? Go ahead while I find it.
So this example was,
Here it is.
he had a caramel-filled chocolate, and he took a bite out of it, he knew there was going to be caramel in it, but from the outside, you couldn't tell if it was just what the filling was going to be. He just kind of built up that pattern, and eventually assumed at that point that the caramel was going to be the same.
Right. Why'd you choose that one? Because it had the swirl on the top, which shows that it is a caramel. And then Warov says that is a certain sort of swirl is correlated with a certain type of filling. You see where this is going. It's a trap, and he should have seen this, right? Because she's leading him to engage in a fallacy. She's saying, look, you chose that particular candy because of previous experiences with candies that have the swirl. What's the swirl analogous to? And what's the caramel analogous to?
Body and like soul.
Body and soul. The swirl is the body that I can perceive, and the sweet, juicy caramel, or whatever, that's your soul. Your soul is like caramel. And just as he argues, I can make the inference that when I have this external representation, that inside we're going to find the same thing. And this goes on for quite a bit. What's wrong with that argument? What's wrong with that comparison? Why is it, and here's the name of the fallacy, which is one of the questions, I think, in your study guide. Why is it a weak analogy?
Is it affirming the consequent?
Well, it depends on how it's presented. Affirming the consequent is a particular kind of fallacy that's put into a hypothetical. If P, then Q, Q, therefore P. Could you fill that in to show us that that's what this is? Okay, that's all right. It could be that. I don't have a way of... we'd have to shoehorn it in. Is that the thing? Shoehorn. You know what a shoehorn is? I don't think anyone uses these anymore. It's just how to get your foot into your shoe without having to stretch it. I guess if you have really expensive shoes, people would use a shoehorn to make sure you don't ruin the shoes. Like my shoes here. These shoes are like... You can't see it in the back. These are extremely expensive. She just said, yeah, I agree. Those are really expensive. And I would use a shoehorn for that too. That's what she said. Stand over here. behind the thing. So, why am I talking about shoehorns? What are they? Is shoehorn? Is that what it's called? Yeah, okay. So anyway.
People still use them.
Do they? Okay. So we're trying to force it into that. That's not particularly the fallacy. The fallacy is saying that recognizing caramel inside the chocolate by the external features is analogous to recognizing your soul by looking at your external features. Why is that a weak analogy? What's wrong there?
You could use another set of analogies to the same thing and come to a different conclusion.
Correct. So how do you mean? That's possible.
Just a lot more further.
No, that's all right. Well, let's think of how analogies work. Is it an apt analogy? Is the comparison good, or are there dissimilarities that weaken the comparison? I saw a hand in here.
Oh yeah, well I was just going to say that you can't recognize your soul by looking at your body because your soul is independent of the body. It can still exist without your body.
That is the specific problem. According to Gretchen, actually no, Gretchen points out, according to Miller himself, the soul is not like nougat or caramel, right? Because the soul, according to Miller, is immaterial, unobservable, invisible, untouchable, and so on, and presumably untasty. You don't bite into somebody and say, yeah, that's the same soul. That's where it's disanalogous, do you see? That argument fails because of that disanalogy. But that's just one fallacy. Keep track. That's one in 2 pages here. And that's called the weak analogy. And that's actually in 3 pages. That was a little bit further. Here's Gretchen's argument. She says, if you recognize me, if you identify me, it can't be from my soul because the soul is not perceivable. So it must be something else that you establish that establishes identity. And then Miller says, I see, I've forgotten the main tenet of my theory, which is an odd thing to say. I've forgotten the whole point of my position, which is probably not going to happen. But again, I think John Perry is sort of inputting fallacies into this view. So it's a bit of a straw man fallacy. When we look at Descartes next time, we'll look at stronger arguments that are less fallacious, perhaps, than Miller's versions here. He says the correlation can be established in my own case. And then keep note of what error this might be. I know that my soul and my body are intimately, consistently found together. And from this one case, I can generalize. What's the problem with ever generalizing from one case to a whole? What is it?
Hasty generalization.
That's exactly right. Hasty generalization. I know from my one case of seeing a pickup truck driver drive like a jackass that they're all jackasses. We've already discussed that that's a horrible instance of reasoning. That's a failure. How is this dissimilar? That seems like a fallacy. Perhaps. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not a hasty generalization. As it's written, it certainly is. But if I'm an advocate of the soul theory and I'm not engaged and not forced to say fallacious things, we might respond with, wait a minute. The correlation between soul and body doesn't require seeing multiple instances. Determining that all pickup truck drivers are jackasses does require seeing multiple instances. If I see a human with two eyes and then infer probably humans all have two eyes, that's not a terrible inference. Because there may be something more objectively, if you want, universal about that feature. Right? That's something that's part of, let's say, I don't want to say essential feature of being a human, but it's certainly more of an essential feature of being human than being a jackass is of being a pickup truck driver. And maybe there's a case to be made that having a soul is part and parcel, is an essential feature of being human. Such that if you know it's in one, you know it's in all. Narwhals have that big horn on that tooth on their face, wherever it's coming out of. If you've seen one narwhal, it's legitimate, we might say, to infer that all narwhals have that horn. And that may not be problematic. However, even if that's our response, and even if it's not quite an extrapolation, as she puts it, a hasty generalization from 1 to a billion, there's a bigger problem. He's guilty of another fallacy, and it's right here. Oh, do you have a question?
Just for the previous point, the only reason we know they're narwhals is because we've seen other ones before.
There's
Just
that
like
too.
with the candy, he's seen them before, so it can't be from one case.
It would
he
be-
hasn't seen one before that.
Yeah, I think I would have to rephrase that. Again, if I'm defending the soul theory and using that argument, it seems odd to say, it doesn't seem enough to say, look, you've seen one narwhal, you've seen them all. Well, that's kind of true with respect to, let's rephrase it.
Why is it?
It has a heart. It has a heart. All narwhals have hearts. Why? Because I saw a narwhal there and it has a heart. Something like that. That's less problematic than saying narwhals are rude. All narwhals are rude. Well, how do you know that? Well, I can't know that from just perceiving one particular, narwhal acting rude. But I see your point. Even as a taxonomist, as a zoologist, they don't say, ooh, there's a new species we found, and just find one instance and say, this is going to be true of all of them. I think it requires a bit more. So it's still a problem, in other words. Then Miller says this. This problem of hasty generalization, you're accusing me of? No problem, really. Because since there's nothing special about my case, I assume the arrangement I find in it applies universally until given reason to presume otherwise. What's that fallacy?
Taking the question.
Yes, that's part of begging the question, but that's another one. That happens a little bit later. This specifically isn't quite, it's a clearer instance, not of begging the question, but of a different fallacy.
Is it like a popular belief?
No, not quite that. Although that could be another fallacy. Everyone believes in souls, therefore souls exist. That wouldn't work either, but he doesn't say that. What's this called? I have a soul, and I know it's the same soul. Prove to me that I don't. What's that called? Misplacing the burden of proof, or arguing from ignorance. So we've got weak analogy with the chocolates. We have potentially a hasty generalization. Then we've got misplacing the burden of proof. I know in my own case I have a soul. You prove to me that I don't. And if you fail to prove that I don't have a soul, then I do have a soul. That doesn't work. That's the same thing with the unicorns. Unicorns exist, man. Prove to me that they don't. Can you do that? If you can't prove that unicorns don't exist, your failure stands as positive evidence for their existence. Therefore, unicorns exist.
Is it possible to prove anything doesn't exist?
Yes. I can prove to you that there's no unicorns in this room right... No, that's no good because they're magical. I can prove to you that there's no elephants in this room. Life-size elephants. That negative I can prove. There's certain negatives that we can prove. Some are really, really hard. And some are impossible. Yeah. Question? No?
Oh, about the elephant.
I just saw a hand.
Oh no, I didn't. I
Oh.
was just talking about because you did. That doesn't prove that they don't exist though. Elephants, that's what
No.
you
Oh, that's true. I can prove a negative that elephants don't exist in this. There's no elephants in this room. But that wouldn't prove there are no elephants. I cannot prove decisively that there are no unicorns. I cannot prove decisively that there's no life on Mars. But I can avoid the misplacing the burden of proof fallacy or arguing from ignorance fallacy if I say scientists, astronomers have studied the surface of Mars exhaustively and have not found any signs of life. Therefore, probably there's no life. That's a legitimate argument, and it's a strong inductive argument. We don't know with certainty, but probably there's not, to the extent that it's an extensive search.
Wouldn't that one also, like, I know you said it comes in later, but wouldn't that still be begging the question because he says, I find it applies universally, so he's assuming that, like, other people, have a soul?
That's what it is. Yeah, it's true. That's related to the other part.
Okay.
He's saying, I know in my own case I have a sameness of soul, and I'm going to apply that universally until somebody could disprove it. But that's the misplacing the burden of proof. And then she asks, well, let it pass. I've got another problem. How is it that you know in your own case that there's a single soul which has been so consistently connected to your body? And here's where he begs the question. You can't really be serious. How can I doubt that I'm the same person that I was? Well, because that's the whole issue at question. Are you the same person that you are through time? Yes. What's your argument? Because it's obvious. Never is that a sufficient justification for anything, really, because it's obvious. Is there anything more clear and distinct? Who uses that language? Who's clear and distinct? Descartes. That's straight out of Descartes, right? Clear and distinct, self-evident, less susceptible to doubt. Well, your job is to prove that it is the case. You haven't proven anything by just saying it's obvious, right? So there's another. That's basically what we might call a proof surrogate. It's standing in place of proof in the way that a surrogate mother stands in place of the actual mother. So there's like 4 or 5, depending on how we count them, fallacies all in one instance. And so that's a problem. That's posing some problems with the soul theory. And as we've seen, there's problems with all of the theories, even though we have intuitions. And here I'm going to give you the last bit before our quiz. To look at with respect to the psychological continuity view as opposed to any of the other views. Although this is consistent with the soul theory too, if the soul is what houses consciousness. Rauhut, page 119. This is an example, a thought experiment from Leibniz. I don't know if I covered this yet. Suppose that you're offered the chance to become the king or queen of China. That is, a person with unlimited wealth and every opportunity to fulfill all of your desires. But on the condition that you undergo a brainwashing that will destroy every memory you currently have. How many would take on that thing, that bargain? What would it be called? Experiment. Would you take that chance? Raise your hand if you'd say, yeah, I'll do that. 1 person? 2 people would do it. 3? 3.5? No, you wouldn't do it? Can't tell. Only 3? Why would you do it?
Because I wouldn't remember making the decision, so what would it matter to me? If I've got everything there, I wouldn't remember making the decision. I wouldn't have remembered anything up to the point where I became king, so I can I'm just a king.
You're just a king. And you'd be like, yeah, this is everything I wanted. How would you know it's everything you wanted?
You wouldn't, but you could. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to you.
It doesn't matter. And you notice
It
that...
doesn't matter to the you who made the decision.
That's right, because that you is gone. Our intuitions are, it's the mind that is the self. And here, the mind is gone. So exactly what you said is an argument against choosing this too, which is interesting. Because why? Would I do this? Well, no, I wouldn't do it because it wouldn't be me who's getting all that I desire. It would be literally what's happening is, hey, would you be willing to take on this thought experiment where I'm going to give you anything you want right now, but on the condition that I give it to somebody else, which is what it seems to be saying. And that doesn't make any sense. here, I'm going to give you everything you want, on the condition that it goes to somebody other than you. That's weird. Yeah.
That sounds like that movie, I forget what it's called, but there's like a red button where you hit it and it's $1 million that you get, but it kills someone, but it ends up being like your family member or something.
Yeah.
And it's
What's
almost
that
like that someone was already gonna have that position, but you do the trade anyway, but you were always gonna do the trade, so you just die and someone else just gets it. And it's
I don't
kind of
know
like-
about all that. I do vaguely remember that. Was it Cameron Diaz in that?
I have no
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, I know that. Was it Adam Sandler again? I wouldn't put it past him. He's in a lot of great hits. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. He's objectively awful. Yes.
Thought about it. Being that your mind may be white, assuming, again, this is assuming it's still you, in the conscious second by second basis there, meaning your memory may be white, but how I'm perceiving the world now would still be the same as how I perceived it after. It's just a matter of my mind's wiped at that point.
Well, notice you say it the way you spoke. My mind is wiped. That means you possess a mind that's clear. You are still something other than your mind. The psychological continuity view is implying, no, you are your mind, you are your conscious states, and if they're gone, you're gone. But, as intuitively appealing as that is, and every movie that deals with identity, it seems to all push, remember the cobbler thought experiment, it all seems to push the Freaky Friday notion. It all seems to push psychological continuity. Meredith Michaels' article in Persons, Brains, and Bodies, which is only a page and a half or 2.5 pages, is actually pushing back against that. And she starts with, there's 2 parts to this assignment, this quiz, it's a group quiz. There's actually 3, but in the interest of time, I think I want to have you focus just on part 1 and 2 and 3. I want you to, and I'll break into groups in a moment. Here are the parts. Briefly explain in your own words Meredith Michaels' thought experiment about Dr. Nefarious, which, by the way, what does nefarious mean? Evil, yeah. Dr. Evil is basically what it comes to. In her paper, Persons, Brains, and Bodies. So what is she trying to show about Dr. Nefarious? There's 2 basic thought experiments. One sort of leading up to the Nefarious example. That's the one we're interested in. The one before it, the Wanda and Shwanda, interesting. And you may talk about it, but don't focus on it. That was the one where Wanda, after going to the library, before you can stop her, she steps out in front of a steamroller. It's such a fantastic thought experiment. And seeing the steamroller, she can't get out of the way of it because she's very slow, apparently, and gets crushed. And you watch this happen, and witnessing the accident, you have a stroke and die. So all thought experiments, as you can see, are terrible. Something horrible happens, like being crushed by a steamroller. And then seeing that, and then dying from watching it. Now, then the question is, we replace body and mind and so forth, body with body, head with body, and so on. Who's the resulting person? So I want you to consider that, but focus on the Nefarious case, and what she's trying to show. What is she trying to demonstrate with the thought experiment? You have to address that question. And then once you've addressed that, get to the third question. Why do you agree or disagree with her thought experiment? Has she successfully made her point? So you have to know what her point is. And then the most important part, in your groups, establish why she is correct or not correct. All right. Normally in groups I count you off and to move you into different